may be seated. Okay, both sides ready to proceed? Let's return the jury. Okay, the state may call the next witness.
State will call Dr. Michael Rickenbach.
Solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you.
I do. Michael Rickenbach, Rickenbach.
May I proceed?
You may proceed.
Sir, how are you employed?
I work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
In what capacity?
I am a forensic chemist examiner within the laboratory division of the FBI.
And how long have you been employed by the FBI in that capacity?
I've been employed with the FBI for a little over 15 years, since 1996, and I've been a forensic chemist examiner since December of 1999.
What is your educational background prior to entering the FBI?
I have 2 Bachelor of Science degrees, one in forensic science and one in chemistry. I have a Master's of Science degree in chemistry, and I have a PhD in chemistry.
And have you had continuing education with the FBI?
Yes, I have.
This time, have you ever been qualified as an expert to testify in the field of forensic chemistry?
Yes, I have.
And can you tell us just a rough approximation of how many times that would have occurred?
Approximately 12 to 15 times.
And would that have been in just federal jurisdictions, state jurisdictions, or a little of both?
Mainly in federal jurisdictions, but I have, on occasion, testified in state court.
This time, Your Honor, I would submit Dr. Rickenbach as an expert in the area of forensic chemistry.
What says the defense?
No objections.
Doctor will be accepted as expert witness in the area of forensic chemistry. You may proceed.
Doctor, in August of 2008, did you receive some items for examination in reference to a victim by the name of Kaylee Marie Anthony?
Yes, I did.
I want to show you a few items and ask if you recognize them.
Earlier today during the break, did we examine these items in evidence?
Yes, we did during the break.
Reference to State's Exhibit IM for identification, did you examine this? Did you recognize it?
Yes, I did. I recognized my initials on the seal over the bag.
And do you recognize that as an item you examined in this case?
Yes, I do.
This time you ought to move into evidence, State's Exhibit IM.
What says the defense? There being no objections to be received in evidence, the state's numbered.
138.
Did you also, during the break, take a look at State's Exhibit for identification IM?
Yes, I did.
And you recognize that as one of the items that was submitted for your evaluation?
Yes, I do. I recognize my initials on that piece of evidence.
This time you ought to move to evidence, State's Exhibit IM for identification.
No.
What? It will be received in evidence, the state's numbered.
139.
State's Exhibit IL for identification. Did you examine this during the break?
Yes, I did.
And you recognize this item as one of the items submitted to you for your evaluation?
Yes, I recognize my initials on the tape seal.
This time, Your Honor, the state will move to evidence takes exhibit IL.
Be received in evidence that states numbered
140.
Show you states exhibit IO. Did you examine that earlier during the break?
Yes, I did.
And do you recognize that as one of the items submitted for your evaluation in this case?
Yes, I do. I recognize my initials on the heat seal.
This time you want to move into evidence states exhibit IO.
what says to defense?
No objections, Your Honor.
To be received in evidence as
Exhibit number 141.
Next, I'll show you states exhibit HS for identification and ask if you recognize. If you look at that during the break, you recognize that.
Yes, I did. I recognize my initials on the tape seal and on the box.
All right, let me just, since I'm here, also show you IK. Did you look at that over the break? Do you recognize that as something submitted to you in this case?
Yes, I do. I recognize my initials over the heat seal.
This time you want to move to evidence states exhibit HS and IK.
No objections.
they would be received in evidence that states numbered
HS will become state exhibit number 142, and IK will be state exhibit number 143.
Sir, were you asked to inspect these items to determine whether you could detect the presence of chloroform?
Yes, I was.
What type, did you use the same type of analysis on each of the items?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Could you just explain to the jury briefly what type of analysis you did and how you did it?
I did a visual examination after opening each item individually and noted any characteristics about the items. I looked at them for any staining, just to try to find where I should sample from. I then took samples, placed them into sealed vials, and did a process called Headspace Gas Chromatography on them.
Let's take them one at a time. Let's start with Q22. What is item Q22? According to your note, and you can refer to your report if you need to.
Do you have a copy of my report?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I do.
the evidence number with the question number.
Let me just pull it up.
Formerly IK. Yeah, we'll start with Q22 if you need to. Just let us know. What is item Q22?
Q22 was a piece of fabric reported to be a piece of the spare tire cover.
And did you submit that? Yes.
What is the state's exhibit number?
Exhibit and evidence number is 143.
Okay.
All right. Now, just take us through what you did with that item as an example of the other examinations.
I opened the can, observed the material inside, took a cutting based on if there were any stains present, put it in a sealed glass vial, and submitted it to Headspace Gas Chromatography analysis.
Now, when you opened the can, did you detect an odor?
Yes, I did.
How do you describe that odor in your report, or how would you describe that odor?
Maybe approach.
You may. You may proceed.
Thank you. You were telling us about your evaluation of your Q22 that I've previously mentioned, the state exhibit. What was the results of your examination of that item?
That residues of chloroform were identified on that specimen.
Discuss State's Exhibit 141, which is see what your Q number. I'm trying to see what the Q number is. Which is your Q44. And what is that item?
Q44 was a piece of fabric material reported to be a piece of a spare tire cover.
Did you subject that to the same analysis that you discussed as to the other exhibit?
Yes, I did.
And what was the result of that analysis?
That residues of chloroform were identified on specimen Q44.
All right. Let me show you State's Exhibit in Evidence 142. Take that. That is your Q45. Is that correct?
Yes, it was.
And did you subject that to the same instrumental examination?
The same instrumental examination that you referred to as the other exhibits.
Yes, I did.
And what was the result of that examination?
That residues of chloroform were identified on specimen Q45.
All right. State's Exhibit in Evidence 139. Would you describe this as do you describe this as the spare tire cover, something to that effect?
Is that specimen Q23 in my?
I'm sorry, yes, your Q23, which is our Exhibit in Evidence 139.
Yes.
And did you subject that to the same instrumental examination as the others that we discussed?
Yes, I did.
Can you tell us, either from your notes or from recollection, what portion of this you tested?
I can look at it. I'm not sure. It's hard to write on this material, but I believe it's that fabric portion right here.
Yes.
Yeah, not the cardboard. Yes.
And again, the same instrumental examination as the others.
Yes, I did.
And what was the result of that examination?
For specimen Q23, residues of chloroform were identified.
Now, the last two items, which are your Q24 and 25, let's start with our Exhibit in Evidence 140, which is your Q24. What is that item?
The U-24 is a piece of fabric material reported to be the left side of trunk liner.
And which side of the trunk liner?
It's reported to be the left side of the trunk liner, specimen Q24.
The left side of the trunk liner. And did you use the same instrumental examination on that you did on the other items?
Yes, I did.
And what was the result of that testing of the liner?
That chemical consistent with chloroform was detected on that item.
Right, what is the difference between a finding of chemicals consistent with chloroform and a finding of the residue of chloroform?
In order to identify that chloroform was present or residues of chloroform were present, we used two different techniques or two techniques in order to get positive results. And at that point, they reinforced each other, and therefore I'm confident to say that chloroform was identified. In the case where it's consistent with chloroform, only one technique gave a result of chloroform. The other technique did not detect chloroform.
So consistent with, but not an identification.
That's correct.
And lastly, your Q25, our exhibit in evidence 140, did you use the same instrumental examination on that you've done the others?
Specimen Q25 reported to be the right side of trunk liner, and yes, I did the same
And
technique.
what were the results?
That chemical chloroform, consistent with chloroform, was detected on that item.
So basically, were the results on the left and right side of the liner the same? That is, consistent with chloroform, but not conclusive?
That is correct.
Thank you, sir. No further questions.
Cross-examination.
May it please the court. Mr. Ashton. Good morning, Dr. Rickenbach.
Good morning.
Nice to meet you, sir.
Nice to meet you.
I want to talk a little bit get a little more in depth about your examinations. Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury a little bit more about the GCMS?
The GCMS, the gas chromatography mass spectrometry instrument, is an instrument that we use, or that is used for separation of chemicals and for the identification of chemicals.
And how sensitive is this gas chromatograph mass spectrometer?
It depends, but if certain types, the ones in particular that we use, can be very, very sensitive.
So basically, you can pick up chemicals that are in, like, water?
I can detect chemicals out of the matrix of water, yes.
And any type of, it basically breaks things down how far as sensitivity is concerned?
It can break it down into that very, very small amounts of chemicals can be detected using a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer system.
And then you did a second test for the flame ionization. Is that? I know I'm butchering that a little bit. The second test that you conducted.
Yes, the second test is very similar to the first test. It just uses a different detector system. The first system uses a mass spectrometer to detect. The second system is, again, the Headspace Gas Chromatography, same technique as the first, except it uses a different a detector to identify or detect the chemicals that come off, that are separated out of the gas chromatograph.
Now, you told the ladies and gentlemen of the jury about residues of chloroform found on the Q22 portion. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Can you tell them what you mean by residues of chloroform?
Chloroform is usually found in a liquid state. And the items of evidence that I got are obviously, they're solid material. And so there was no liquid on those items. But when subjected to very sensitive techniques, the chloroform that was identified in those items can be driven off and detected by the instrument. And therefore, since it's not a liquid, it's really in very, very small amounts. It's residues of chloroform on these materials.
So they were found in very, very small amounts.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And you can find chloroform in any number of household items, correct?
It has been detected in household cleaning agents and other items, yes.
Including detergents,
That is correct.
and you can even find chloroform in water, right? Drinking water?
It depends on the drinking water, yes, but if it's present in an amount that the instrument can detect, yes, you can detect it.
And you can also find it in chlorine from a swimming pool, can you not?
I have no firsthand knowledge. I've never analyzed the chlorinated products like water from swimming pools for chloroform, so I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Do you know if someone threw a bathing suit after going swimming in the trunk of a car, whether that might generate chloroform?
Objection, hypothetical based on facts, not on evidence.
Sustain.
Sir, do you know what other products chloroform could be found in, like soda?
I've heard no firsthand knowledge that chloroform is in soda products.
Okay. Do you have you any knowledge in other items other than cleaning items that chloroform could be found in?
From my personal experience, usually it's a cleaning product that I have found chloroform in. But I mean, there may be other items that have chloroform that I haven't personally analyzed.
And those would be found in very, very low amounts, such as what you found in this case.
Objection, assumes a fact, not an evidence.
Overruled.
The items that were consistent with cleaning products that I've detected chloroform were in very small amounts, similar to these items, yes.
Okay. Now, can you explain to the... With the court's permission, can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what a chromatogram looks like?
A chromatogram is a graphic output from an instrument, a gas chromatograph, that is a graph of the signal coming from the instrument based on if a chemical is present or not, or something that's coming off of the instrument, the chemicals that are separated. If it's detected, it'll go up in intensity, the plot will go up, and on the x-axis as it goes across, the time that it's taking for the chemicals to come off the column to be separated.
May the witness stand down, Your Honor, to demonstrate to the jury.
Witness may stand down.
Dr. Rickenback, can you show us a raw example of what a chromatogram might look like? Perfect, thank you. Everybody see that okay? Okay, Dr. Rickenbach, when you do run a sample through the GCMS, does the item tell you how much chloroform is present?
In a quantitative amount telling you exactly how much, no, it does not.
Okay. And there's a difference between what is called a quantitative analysis and a qualitative analysis. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what the difference is?
A qualitative analysis is a type of analysis where you're just trying to identify or detect the substance that you're analyzing. In this case, just chloroform. You're not giving really any information in your final report as to how much is there. If you were going to give a report as to how much of a substance is in a certain sample, that would be both a qualitative, identifying the component, and then also giving it a numeric amount, which would be a quantitative.
So to break it down, qualitative tells you it's there. Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
And quantitative tells you how much.
That's correct.
Now, you can't just look at a graph and tell what the quantity is, correct?
You can't tell an exact quantity. You can get some information based on relative amounts, but based on a qualitative analysis, you really wouldn't give a number.
Okay. And in fact, looking at it that way without running what's called a standard is not a very good way of, or a scientific way of doing this, correct? Finding out a quantitative amount.
If you were going to report out an actual amount, just doing an analysis without a standard or without the appropriate technique for quantitative analysis would not be a good way.
Correct. Now, when you analyze these samples, you had an internal standard, is that correct?
I analyzed the samples in dual mode, if you will. I analyzed them twice. I took one cutting that was without an internal standard and then another cutting that had an internal standard and ran them together at the same time.
And that's how you were able to determine that they were at very, very, very low amounts.
Not with the internal standard, no.
Okay. How exactly were you able to determine that they were at very, very low
With
amounts?
with every analysis, it's appropriate to run what's called a negative control and a positive control. A negative control would be no sample, just to show that your instrument doesn't have the compound of interest somewhere in its system. So you make sure that the result should be negative. And then at the end of the analysis, you run what's called a positive control to make sure that the instrument is working properly so that you can detect the substance that you're looking for, in this case chloroform, appropriately. And so at the end of the analysis, I ran a positive control of chloroform, a chloroform standard that I made up myself. And based on the response of a known amount of chloroform that I analyzed, the chloroform that came out of the specimens was significantly less than the amount that I knew I had put into the instrument.
And it wasn't overwhelming amount of chloroform, was it?
On the specimens?
Yes.
It was significantly less than not the internal standard, the positive control that I analyzed.
And it wasn't the most chloroform you'd ever seen in 20 years, was it?
It was not the most chloroform I've seen in 20 years, no.
And it's not what you would call shockingly high levels of chloroform, would it?
No, it's not.
Now, I know with the cues and the identification letters, we get a bit confused. I want to break it down if we can as to what item you tested and what you ended up getting. The Q22 is the left front line, correct?
It's reported as a piece of the spare tire cover.
Okay, spare tire cover. And this is the one that you found residues of chloroform.
Residues of chloroform were identified on that specimen, yes.
And again, when we say residues, we're talking about very low levels.
Significantly lower levels than the positive control, yes.
Q23 was what, sir?
Q23 was reported to be the spare tire cover.
So it was another portion of the spare tire cover?
I think it's the entire, I'm not sure about the whole tire cover. It's that item right there.
It's just the second. You ran a test on another area of the spare tire cover.
Of a area on the cover, yes. It's
Okay.
not the entire cover.
And this was also significantly lower than your positive control at low levels.
That's correct.
Now, what are the other items from the trunk that you tested?
They were specimen Q24, reported to be the left side of trunk liner. Q25 reported to be the right side of the trunk liner.
Okay, let's start off with Q24. What were your results with this? Was this consistent with chloroform?
That a chemical consistent with chloroform was detected on that item.
And when you say consistent with, you mean one of the tests detected it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that would still be at these low levels, correct?
That's correct.
And the second method didn't even pick it up.
That's correct.
So it's 1 out of 2 tests. And that's when you say it's consistent with.
That's correct.
That phrase consistent with is a pretty tricky phrase, right? You have to explain it?
Yes.
Okay. Q25 was the right trunk liner?
Q25 was reported to be the right side of trunk liner.
And this was also consistent with, right?
That a chemical consistent with chloroform was detected. Yes.
And that's because you had the one test that was at very low levels and the second test that didn't even pick it up.
That is correct.
Now, what other items did you test from the car?
Item Q44 was reported to be a piece of the spare tire cover.
And what were the results of that?
That chloroform, residues of chloroform was identified on that item
At the low levels.
at significantly lower levels than the positive control. Yes.
Any other items that you tested from the car?
Specimen Q45 reported to be a piece of the spare tire cover.
And that was the same results as Q44?
Yes, that residues of chloroform were identified.
At significantly lower levels than your positive control.
Yes.
What else did you test from the car?
I'm not sure what, I have tested other items, but I'm not sure if they came from the car or where they came from. But on this submission, this batch of submission, those were the only pieces of evidence that I analyzed.
Did you test the steering wheel cover of the car?
You may.
Doctor, I just want to conclude with these levels of, I guess, residue levels of chloroform that were found and tested are equal to what you might find in a common cleaning product, is it not, sir?
Yes, from my experience, those levels have been detected in substances that have been used for cleaning products, yes.
Thank you, sir.
Redirect.
Did you find any other substances that were consistent with cleaning products in your evaluation?
I'm sorry, in evaluation of what exactly?
Of the samples? Was there anything else about the evaluation that would have indicated these were cleaning products?
I was specifically tasked with looking just for chloroform, so I really didn't do an analysis for cleaning products on these items.
Right. So let's talk. You talked to counsel about words like low, very low, residue. Those are all sort of vague comparative terms, correct? I mean, low as opposed to high is sort of depending on your perspective, correct?
They're subjective terms, yes.
Okay. Have you ever been called upon in your career to test a solid dry object for chloroform?
Before this, I can't recall ever specifically just looking for chloroform, no.
Your other experiences have always been in looking for chloroform in liquid form.
I have never really had an experience where something was submitted in a liquid form just looking for chloroform. However, there have been unknown liquids that I've analyzed using this technique where chloroform was identified.
Were those like product tampering kind of investigations?
Yes, that's the type of case. Product tampering or just general unknown analysis where they don't know what the substance is.
So what might be a high or low amount of chloroform in a carpet sample? Would you really have much of a perspective on that?
I would have nothing really to reference. We have, in order to answer that question appropriately, you'd want to do some control studies and spiking carpet samples with chloroform or whatever you're looking for and doing a validation kind of study.
Now, with reference to State's Exhibit 139 in evidence, the Verifier cover, how did that come to you?
It came to the chemistry unit through the normal operation of our laboratory through our evidence control unit.
Let me rephrase. How was it packaged?
Cross, rather.
Overall?
How is it packaged? I'm sorry, that's specimen Q23?
Yeah, the trunk liner. How was it packaged?
That was found inside a box.
All right. Inside a cardboard box like the one we have in front of us here.
That's correct.
What effect would that packaging have on the levels of a volatile substance like chloroform on an object like this?
Overall?
Based on the properties of chloroform, it would allow chloroform to leak out. It's not an airtight container.
Were you, in fact, surprised that you got any chloroform off of this object?
Yes, I was.
Speculation.
Overall?
And explain to the jury why you were surprised that you got anything off that.
When I was initially tasked with doing this type of analysis, chloroform is a volatile substance, and it doesn't stay around very long under normal conditions that I use. Having an object come in like this package like that to detect for chloroform, I was very surprised to even get a result for chloroform.
Is that because you would have expected the chloroform to have volatilized?
Yes, volatilized and not been detected.
But yet you were still able to detect chloroform even on that unsealed object?
Yes, I was.
Now, rather than use high, low, there are actual numbers that we can apply to some of these issues about the amounts of chloroform. General numbers, are there not?
The numbers that you can compare to are the numbers of the intensity of the peak that on the graph when you get a peak. The height or the area of the peak, you can compare my positive control, the known amount of chloroform that I added to one sample versus the amount of chloroform that you would have detected on another object.
And that is basically what you're referring to as not a completely quantitative analysis, but sort of an idea of how much is there based on that comparison. Is that correct?
Yes, it would not be appropriate to say that would be a quantitative analysis, but you can get an idea, yes.
Now,
The control, I think the internal standard, or was it the positive control, that you mixed? You said you mixed a control of chloroform, correct?
The positive control was a known amount of chloroform.
And you mixed that to a certain concentration, is that correct?
That is correct.
And what was that concentration?
In our percentage, it's 0.01% in water.
Can you translate that into parts per million?
That would correlate to approximately 100 parts per million.
100 ppm, parts per million. Right. So that is the standard against which you compare your test results in determining a general idea of how much there is, correct?
I don't use it to determine how much there is. I just used it as, so I wouldn't put too much on, or wouldn't put too little in the instrument. It's just an amount that I use to detect the qualitative positive control.
But when you're referring to getting some general idea of the quantity by comparing the known to the control, that's what you talked about, this 100 ppm.
Yes, initially this is a qualitative analysis, but later on I was asked to give some kind of indication about quantity, and this is the only really way you can kind of get an idea of the amounts.
Just to be fair, this is a very rough estimate, correct?
That's correct.
So as to your Q22, which is a piece of the spare tire cover that was in a can, is that correct?
Yes, it was in a can, airtight can.
What does it being sealed in a can, why is that a better way of keeping something than putting it in a box?
For this type of analysis, where you're trying to analyze for a volatile substance in a very small amount, in residue amounts, submitting the evidence in a heat-sealed container, such as this unlined metal can, is the appropriate way to do it.
All right. Now, as to Q22, are you able to do a rough percentage of how much chloroform there was that you found in the sample as compared to the standard control?
I would be hesitant to put a number or a percent. I'm more comfortable with just saying that it's compared the height of the peaks, or the area of the peak, compared to my positive control, it's significantly less.
But you did prepare a rough percentage, did you not?
When asked in future conversations about can I give some idea of percentages, it's not the appropriate way to do it in forensic science, but I did give a percentage.
What is the general range of the percentage of the standard of Q22 to the standard?
I gave you that information. I don't have the information in front of me. I mean,
if you need to reference that.
Based on the data that I had submitted, and based on the area counts and the height counts, this information has not been peer-reviewed or tech-reviewed. It's just a conversation that he wanted. It's 5%, based on the comparison of the positive control.
And again, this is a very rough estimate, correct?
Yes.
So the amount of chloroform was somewhere in the neighborhood of 5% of the control, which was 100 parts per million.
The 5% is what I calculated. I can't say for certainty what the actual amount is.
How about Q23?
It's approximately 0.1%.
0.1%. And Q23 is the actual unsealed spare tire cover.
Yes, that is correct.
So would it be fair to say that the sealed container contained much greater level of chloroform than the unsealed spare tire cover?
For the specimen Q22, it did, but there were other items that were submitted under sealed.
Let's go on to those. I'm going to skip 224 and 25 because you said those were just consistent with chloroform, correct?
Q24 and Q25 were consistent with, they were
Those
detected.
are the trunk liners. Okay, we'll skip over those. How about Q44? Was that also carpet sample, a sample in a sealed container?
Yes, it was.
And again, what is the rough percentage on that?
The rough percentage is approximately 1%, as compared to the positive control.
As compared to the positive control. Okay. How about Q45?
It's approximately 0.2%.
So the highest concentration, again, with this rough area of estimating, is on the Q22 sealed sample in a can.
Yes. However, you have to take into account that the amount that I sampled, that I actually cut out, was not the same. I didn't make sure that each amount of sample that I cut between the different specimens was exactly the same. So you're going to have, if I took a bigger cutting on Q22 and a smaller cutting on Q45, and they had the same amount of chloroform on them, because I cut more out of one specimen, I'm going to find more in the sample. So it's a very, it's not the best way to relate these numbers.
Whatever the amount of chloroform actually is in the sample, would the chloroform in that sample, in the cans, have evaporated prior to it getting put in the can?
It's possible.
If this trunk were left open for, say, 6 or 7 hours, then sealed, and then a few weeks later, this sample of chloroform, this sample of trunk liner was taken, would you expect the chloroform amount to be the same when the sample was taken as it was 2 weeks before the car was aired out?
Objection, Judge. Gives a hypothetical.
Outside of cross-examination.
Overruled.
Just based on the properties of chloroform.
Based on the properties of chloroform, being that it's a very volatile chemical, if it was into an open atmosphere, I would expect less to remain on the items than if it was in a closed container.
So would you, I think we've gone far enough with that. If these figures accurately reflect the amount of chloroform in the sample, would that add up to the low parts per million range, if it's accurate?
Yes.
All right, now, other than testing for chloroform in liquids, have you ever experienced testing for chloroform in air samples?
No, I have not.
Would you have any knowledge about what is significantly high or low in an air sample?
Objection, Judge. Goes outside scope.
Cross.
Overruled.
No, I have no firsthand knowledge of analysis of air samples.
So the context in which you answered the question about high, low, shocking, that's in the context of your evaluation of liquid samples containing chloroform.
Or in this case, residual samples, they're not non-liquid.
I mean, prior to this one, it would have been liquid samples.
Judge.
I'm going to object. This is outside the scope and highly misleading.
Overruled. She did.
She did not hear it.
Did you? Highly misleading.
Outside the scope and highly misleading. Okay. Overruled. Next question, Mr. Ashton.
I guess my point is, you're in answering the questions of the defense counsel, they're from the context of your prior experience, mostly testing it for chloroform in liquids. Correct?
Yes.
No further questions.
Recross.
Doctor, you testified that doing an estimate like this and trying to determine the quantity of chloroform is not appropriate in forensic science. Is that correct?
Yes, to give a formal amounts of a compound, doing it this way is not the correct way to do it.
And that's because you don't want to attempt to give anything that would mislead a jury.
Objection. Counsel's commentary, may we approach?
No, overruled. You can answer the question if you can.
No, I would not want to give an impression of amounts, specific amounts within these samples, because it's not appropriate to even give a specific amounts based on the techniques that I used.
Because as a scientist, you want to be precise,
Yes, that's true.
especially when testifying in a court of law.
Yes.
Now, you testified that you don't have any experience in collecting chloroform from a solid, I guess, a piece of carpet or any other solid object.
Other than what I did in this case, before that, I've never tried to analyze for chloroform in carpet samples. No.
So trying to guess how much chloroform would be there versus not would be nothing more than a guess, would it not?
Trying to determine how much is there is not the correct way to do it qualitatively.
And qualitatively determining whether something is sent in a box or a can, since you have no experience in this type of testing, that too would also be speculation.
Well, on packaging, I have firsthand knowledge, and based on my experience with chemistry, the way that evidence is packaged, I do have knowledge about that and how it should be appropriately packaged.
Well, maybe I posed the question poorly. But to give a quantitative amount and to estimate quantitatively as to how much, that would be speculation.
Yes.
I have no further questions. Thank you, sir.
You may?
I want you to understand,
If no legitimate information can be obtained about the quantity of chloroform, how is it possible to answer defense counsel's question that it's similar to what's in cleaning products?
Judge, that's outside the scope of my
Recross. I would object.
Overruled.
I think I can answer the question not based on quantitative, but on qualitative analysis.
Okay, go ahead.
That if we can detect chloroform in cleaning products, it's you can detect it in these items, and it's just the amounts are compared to the positive control.
Okay, so when you said that it's similar to the amounts in cleaning products, you simply meant by that it's detectable.
That's correct.
So when you answered counsel's question, that's all you meant was simply that it was detectable.
Yes.
Oh, thank you for that clarification. Nothing further.
All right. Okay. Witness may be excused. Thank you, doctor.
Subject to recall, Your Honor.
Yes. Ms. Ashton, I think these are your reports up here. State may call their next witness.
The state calls Jason Forgy.
Need discussion and argument.
There is no argument. Either the state established the proper foundation or they don't. They do that by testimony.
Solemnly swear or affirm.
I do.
Jason R. Forgy, Jason R. Forgey.
You may proceed.
Good morning. Please tell the members of the jury how you are employed.
With the Orange County Sheriff's Office, I'm currently assigned to Specialized Patrol, the K-9 unit.
How long have you been with the Orange County Sheriff?
A little over 17 years, since 1994.
And you mentioned that you are in specialty patrol with the K-9 unit. What does that mean?
I'm a K-9 handler. Currently handle a German Shepherd, a full-service dog, and have worked a dog since 2001.
So for the last 10 years or so, you've been exclusively handling canines for law enforcement purposes.
Yes, ma'am.
What sort of training or education did you receive that initially qualified you for that position?
I cross-trained with the K-9 unit because I had interest to go into the K-9 unit prior to interviewing or actually going into the unit. Cross-training meaning I went over there and watched them work dogs. I caught dogs, talked to them about working dogs, and then I transferred there in 2001.
All right. So prior to your transfer, did you actually have a dog that you trained with, or was that sort of an education process for you?
I received a dog in 2001 because when I went into the unit, I went in as a part-time handler. And then a couple months after I did my training, I went into as a full-time handler because I went in as a part-time bloodhound handler originally.
Now, you train not independently of the dog, correct?
Correct.
So when you first go into this unit, what sort of training is there for you? And you indicated your initial assignment was with a bloodhound.
Correct. It was scent discrimination. Man trailing is the first school I went to with my assigned dog with the sheriff's office.
Okay. And when we're talking about bloodhounds, we're speaking of dogs that will track specific individuals, correct?
Correct.
So how long is that sort of training?
That training is usually 5 weeks long. It's 3 weeks in a classroom and 2 weeks in the field. And then you have your proficiency test at the end of those 5 weeks.
Was this canine Garrett
Yes.
the first bloodhound or first dog that you worked with at the Orange County Sheriff's Office?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Aside from the initial training period that was completed, did you do follow-up training with this dog?
Yes.
What would that consist of?
We have a minimum requirement of training that we do per month. With Garrett, it required a minimum of 2 tracks a month, training tracks a month. A trainer or an evaluator or a supervisor would come out and watch your dog quarterly to make sure your dog was working correctly.
So how long did you work with Canine Garrett?
I believe it was around 10 or 11 months until we had to put him down.
After that point, did you get another canine assignment?
Yes. Then I received my second dog, which was Ike, another bloodhound.
So did you train Ike?
Yes.
Okay, what did that consist of?
Same thing. We did the scent discrimination, man tracking, man trailing. Scent discrimination basically is you teach him to learn the odor of what you sent him on. If I sent him on an individual shoe of one person and there's 3 people in the classroom, he has to go to that one person correctly before he can move to the next stage.
How long did you work with Canine Ike?
Until I gave him to another handler years later. And I believe that would have been somewhere in 2004 or 2005.
Now, at some point in time, did you have multiple dogs that you were training?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. In different things?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So in addition to Ike, did you have another dog?
Yes.
What was that?
In 2002, I received a German Shepherd from a breeding program. His name was Bones, and his specialty were human remains. He was a cadaver dog, single purpose.
Okay. Explain to us what that is.
Single purpose dog means he has one job and one job only. Along with his obedience that he's trained, he's taught to detect human decomposition, specifically cadavers. We go through approximately 160 hours specialty training in that. Then the dog's certified in the proficiency of working, and then we can actually be deployed in the field. I was chosen for that after the 9/11 towers because the 2 dogs that we did have were converted over to EOD dogs, so we didn't have one. EOD dogs? EOD dog is an explosive dog. We needed more bomb dogs at the time, so they were converted over, and then I became the next person in line, and then I worked the 2 dogs, the German Shepherd and the Bloodhound.
Ike and Bones.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, what is involved in training a single-purpose dog for human remains detection? When I imagine that the training is different than what you had undergone with Garrett and Ike.
Correct. You go through an imprinting stage. First, you have an introduction to the odor to see if the dog will be okay with the odor. You introduce the dog to the odor. And then you do an imprinting stage where you just constantly take the dog straight to odor. And when he goes to odor, you train him for what you would like him to do at his final alert. If you choose to make your dog sit at the odor, at the source, when he locates what you're training him to do, then when you go to source at the imprinting stage, you just take him to it and tell him sit, and then you reward him. And after that stage, then you start him into searching. For instance, if you have cans and your odor is in one can, you would put out multiple cans. And then you would give him his command, and you would have him check the cans. And it's his job not to pass the correct can. And you reinforce that with a sit. And then he gets his toy.
All right.
and his handler prays.
So when you refer to something as an alert, is that the dog's indication to you that they've detected the scent that they have been imprinted on and trained on?
A final trained alert is when he does, if you trained him to do a sit or you trained him to do a down at odor. An alert, I would define an alert as any body behavioral change that I recognize that he does when he is in odor and working the odor.
That's different than the final trained alert that you had mentioned?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. The final trained alert is?
When he has worked to source and does his, we teach him to work to source. So
what does
when,
that mean?
If I may,
You may.
if my water bottle is the source of the odor and it's coming out and funneling down, if the dog is working from this side of the monitor, you would see his body behavioral change when he works it, whether it's his breathing pattern or his walking or his lifting his nose, he's working into odor. The wind's coming from this direction. You would see him start to bracket. He would work the odor back and forth and work it to source. This constant time here, by training him and working so many odors with him, you would know that he's in odor and he's alerting to the odor, but he hasn't gotten to the source yet. So he would work to source, get to here, and then give me my final trained alert. If it was a sit, he would go to a sit. That's the best way I could explain.
All right. So let me see if I understand. Once the dog detects the odor, as the handler who has trained with the dog, you can see that there's a behavioral change.
Absolutely.
Then when the dog works to the source or as close as possible to the source, it's your expectation that the dog will then give a final trained alert.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you train Bones to proceed in this fashion?
Yes.
What was Bones' final trained alert?
His final trained alert was a sit.
Sit.
Yes, ma'am.
What sort of, I know you used water as a demonstrative aid, but what sort of aids were used to imprint Bones before he was actually used in casework?
In the imprinting stage
Sorry.
or the whole training stage?
We can start with imprinting and then move through training.
In the imprinting stage, we used mostly the rags with decomp, human decomp, rags that had been soaked up with the chest cavities, in the chest cavity of a cadaver. A deceased person already would taken rags and stuck it in the chest cavity where there's a lot of bodily fluids that's decomping, and we would use that primarily.
All right, so that's the imprinting stage. Do you then move to different training aids once the dog is imprinted on that scent?
Yes.
Specifically, as it relates to Bones, what sort of training aids did you utilize?
We used bones, not just his name, but actual human bones, placentas, the chest cavity rags. The pseudo-scent that we did use, it was drowned victim only.
What is that? Pseudo-scent mean?
Pseudo-scent is a man-made odor, a tablet. I actually brought some with me.
Okay. Is it something, you said it was drowning victim only, so do you put that into water and see then if the dog can be trained to detect that?
Correct. You would put the tablet in odor or into the water, the pond, the retention pond, the lake, and the tablet puts out the odor of drowned victim. I like to use that way I wasn't creating any kind of biohazard. If it was in a retention pond, I really wouldn't worry about it, but it's easier to do. You drop your tablets in the water, you let it sit for a little bit, and you run your dog on it.
Okay. All Right. Other than that, do you recall any of the training aids used with bones?
Why I had them, I believe that we used blood also. Bones, blood, pseudo, tissue, the decomp on the rags, placenta, grave dirt, dirt from where a cadaver had actually been recovered from, the fluids that suck up in the soil there, we use that also. And I believe that's going to be all that I used with him at that time.
Now, you made some reference to the fact that you don't have bones
Correct.
anymore. At some point, was there a decision made by the Orange County Sheriff that that a full-service dog, not a single-purpose dog, would be needed for the agency?
Yes. I'm sorry.
Once that decision was made, what happened to bones?
Once that decision was made with Bones, we went and trained and tried to make him a full-service dog, an apprehension dog, commonly referred to as a bite dog, and he didn't make it. The agency then made the decision because they had previously made the decision that they would like me to work a full-service dog. They went ahead and retired him. And he ended up going to a captain. I believe he was a captain at our agency at the time, and that's when Osceola was looking. Sergeant Brewer got him from the captain.
All right. So, if I'm understanding you correctly, the Osceola County Sheriff's Office decided they could use a single-purpose dog.
Correct.
For the human remains detection work.
Correct. Because at the time, locally sworn law enforcement personnel, cadaver dog-wise, I covered multiple counties. I was it.
For how long?
For a while.
Okay. So you're talking about going to Brevard County or Seminole County, Lake County, because
Correct.
Bones was the only cadaver dog in the area for a period of time?
Correct. Sworn-wise, there were still some search and rescue groups out there, but law enforcement-wise, I was it.
So once that decision was made to have a full-service dog assigned to you, do you get another
Yes,
canine?
ma'am. Yes. I was still working the Bloodhound as well, and then we purchased Garrus.
Okay. And what type of a dog is Garrus?
Garrus is a German Shepherd.
Did Garrus come from the same breeding program that you mentioned as it relates to Bones?
No, they had stopped the breeding program at that point, and we bought Garrus from one of our vendors that we use to purchase our dogs from.
So did Garrus come from Germany?
Yes, he did. He was imported. I believe he'd been here roughly 4 or 5 days when I got him.
Was he a puppy?
No.
How old was he?
He was, I believe he was 20 months, 21 months, something like that. I know his birthday was October 20th. And he will be 9 this October.
Okay. So what happened once you received Garrus? Is he then sent through a program for the full service dog?
Yes. We then start, I believe it was August 6th of 2004. We started a 400-hour school for our base. It's called Basic Patrol Canine Work. You go in there, you teach your obedience, your building searches, area searches, your criminal apprehension, your scent discrimination, man tracking, and that's it. That's your 400-hour school.
Okay. So once that 400-hour school is completed, is Garrus certified to actually do casework?
In police work, yes, ma'am. He's then FDLE certified. We go out and he's evaluated by 2 outside evaluators, and they evaluate him in his obedience, and everything at our evaluation stage is off lead. He does his obedience, routines, hand and voice, criminal apprehension, the control work, the buildings, and the areas. He's evaluated and then certified through the state of Florida FDLE-wise.
Now, you work with him during this evaluation process, correct? He doesn't get tested by some other handler. That's a team concept.
Correct. You are the only person that works with your dog. When he's tested, you're tested.
After fulfilling these certification requirements that you've described, does Garrus receive additional training in human remains detection?
Yes. Then they like to give him a little bit of break, let him work the road, a break from school, and then we go back to school and he does 160 hours for his basic human remains detection work, cadaver dog work.
And what is involved in that course?
It's the same thing. Same thing we did with bones. You introduce him to the odor, you imprint him, and then you teach him to work odor, and you teach him his responses. His final alert was different than bones. I taught him a down instead of a sit.
What does that mean?
A down being the dog lays down at source.
What sort of items did you utilize to imprint Garrus on the scent of human remains?
Same thing as bones. We used the rags that were soaked in chest cavities to include some placenta.
And once he is imprinted on the scent, what sort of training aids were used with Garrus?
We used the grave dirt, human bones, adipocere, mummified muscle, blood, placenta, burnt bones, cremated remains from a human. We used human parts to include a leg, a foot, and then pseudoscent again.
For drowned
victim,
only?
right. He had exposure to another pseudoscent, but I did not train with that. It wasn't in my normal training thing.
During this training process, do you also attempt to, and correct me if I'm using the wrong language, proof them off of other odors that could distract them from what they're trained to do?
Never had a bone at all, at home, at work, at anything. He never received a bone, whether it was a rawhide bone or anything. I didn't give it to him because I didn't want to teach him that he should chew on bones, especially if we're looking for bones. We trained him around ham. We trained him around ham bones. We trained him about dumpsters. We trained him around gas that you would use in your car, regular gas. We trained him as distractors also with cheeseburgers, with pizza, with decomposing animals. We trained him around where other animal scent was. We trained in horse rings, their training rings. So not only did you have the horse odor, you had the horse poo, urine, all the other distractors there. So we purposely train that way.
You mentioned just horses as far as the animal sense. Would that training process include making sure that Garrus in particular wouldn't alert to the scent of, say, dog urine or feces as well?
Correct. And at some of the seminars you go to, we have multiple dogs. There would be 50 dogs there or whatever. And you also have the other dogs near our training fields that urinate on bushes and poles and stuff. And you train around that all the time, and they're not going to alert to that at all.
Now, aside from a training aid or something to distract them, do you expose them to, and I guess we're talking about Garrus in particular, did you expose him to different environments, whether that be buildings, cars, rubble piles, landfill, things like that, so that there's a variety of different things that he's exposed to before he actually does police work?
Yes, I tried to expose them to everything that I could think of at the time. I went to the fire department's training rubble. I would call it a rubble pile. It's where they have concrete with rebar stuck through and broken pipes and mains and all that stuff. And I would hide stuff in there to, in my mind, mock a disaster area where I might have to recover a body or search. I put them in drainage pipes. I put training aids in cars, under cars, in fields. About every scenario that I could think of at the time, I would put a training aid there.
Now, when you are training Garrus, you know where this scent is hidden, correct?
Correct.
At some point after Garrus completes his initial training, does he go with you to specialty schools?
Yes, he does.
In these specialty schools, are scenarios set up where both you and the dog obviously is always unaware, but both you and the dog have no idea where the training aid has been set up?
Correct. Before he certifies and is able to work the calls, he's tested by our evaluator, and those are all unknown finds.
Unknown to you?
Correct. They're always unknown to the dog, but unknown to myself as a handler.
Why is that important?
It's how they evaluate you and your dog as a team before you start working.
Have you heard of cueing or any sort of bias on the part of a handler that could affect the performance of a dog?
Yes, creating the false alert stuff, yes.
All right. What was done with Garrus to avoid that situation from occurring?
Generally, you're only going to see creating the false alert or the cueing with your newer handlers. Our department goes at great lengths to try and avoid that. Why are you training them? While you're training them, they purposely, the trainer with you, is purposely telling you, keep walking, keep moving, don't stop walking to cue the dog. And that's why it goes in stages where you introduce them, you imprint them, and then you start your searches. If I was doing a search of just this straight wall, I would let the lead, and he's on lead, I would let the lead slack in my hand. And if I see he's working the odor, and when he stops, I'm going to keep moving, walking. Well, of course, I'm going to come at a point to the end of the lead. Purposely, I keep moving, whether it is the half moon behind him or whether it's just moving my feet back and forth. And that's what we do to try and avoid and make sure you don't cue your dogs. But those problems are usually only with your newer handlers, your inexperienced people.
Did Garrus undergo an evaluation?
Yes.
By an outside agency?
Yeah, he was our evaluator with our agency, but he was not involved in the training.
All right. Well, that was initially?
Initially, yes.
All right.
I'm sorry, you're referring to the school.
Yeah, after his initial evaluation by the Orange County Sheriff's Office, he was certified to do work for the agency.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, all kinds of work.
Yes, ma'am.
Including the cadaver dog work that you've described.
Correct.
Did he then go to a basic cadaver school hosted by an entity independent of the Orange County Sheriff's Office.
Yes.
Where did that take place?
It took place in Sarasota, Florida. One of the search and rescue groups had organized for Andy Redmond to come down and his company to come down and host a seminar, a school in Sarasota, and I applied for that and went to it.
All right. Is Andy Redmond one of these individuals who's recognized as a leader in the field of cadaver dogs?
Yes, he is.
So this independent training that Garrus received was one conceived by this individual, the
Yes.
training program. How long is it?
And that was a week-long seminar.
Let me have a moment.
You know what? Why don't we go ahead and stop at this point? And then we'll come back after lunch. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we're going to recess for lunch at this time. I hope you enjoy your lunch today. That's all I'm going to say. Any additional instructions on behalf of the state of Florida or the defense?
No, sir.
Okay. We'll be in recess to 1:30 or till the jury comes back.